Hi, my name is Tanya Gupta. I'm an assistant professor in the psychology department and neuroscience program at Santa Clara University. My dissertation research focused on how the brain tracks the passage of time, specifically how a region of the brain called the hippocampus is involved in that process. And currently, I work on prefrontal cortex circuits in decision making and complex behaviors. I'm interested in how brain activity changes when we have to change the way we behave. I think I would have to say I'm most proud of the variety of things I've been able to do. Everybody comes into academia with a little experience, different experiences. I went straight from my undergrad, and it was a very small undergraduate university that lacked kind of the big lab structure that people expect at large graduate institutions. And I went straight from there into a graduate school with large labs, and I'm really proud of what I've been able to learn and accomplish in biology and neuroscience and computation. And I'm proud that I've been able to gain expertise in many different fields like psychology and biology and coding. I think coming in a little bit almost naive helped in that way. And I'm mostly proud of being in the position that I am now as an assistant professor, which is really a dream come true. It's not really something I even knew would happen, so it's definitely my biggest accomplishment, and I'm using it as a stage, hopefully, for future accomplishments. I think what comes to mind in terms of a challenge is my very last experiment of my dissertation. And I had put almost all the care and love and lessons I had learned, I thought, into this very last experiment, 5 or 6 years in. And it went horribly. It failed. And I did research on timing, as I mentioned. And so part of my work was to train rodents on very complex timing tasks and for them to learn to expect food at certain intervals. And so I had a lot of experience training animals to study timing. And I had designed this somewhat complex timing task with a lot of care, right? And I thought, this is complex, but this is all grounded in science. These are things that I've done and planned with a lot of care. And I had planned how to train the animals with a lot of care. And I thought I knew everything that could go wrong. And it totally all went wrong. And so that was definitely the biggest failure I had in grad school. A lot of feelings came up after that related to the fact that I had spent so much time planning and feeling like that was really for nothing. I also felt failure because this was based on an idea I had. It was an independent project of mine. There were also drugs involved in this experiment. I was administering a pharmacological agent to the animals. And when I started to run the experiment and pull the data and look every day to see if the animals responded to the pharmacological agent, as well as to if the animals were responding at the appropriate time, every day I looked and we were getting closer to the big treatment day of the experiment, and they were not learning it at all. And so the animals really didn't learn the intervals. And I had maybe 20 or 30% of the subjects of my experiment who were not really doing anything. They were not really responding. This is the first time this had happened to me. And in this type of research, you already have limited numbers of subjects. So if 20% of them are not performing, that's already a very high level, in my mind, a very high level of failure, or, very trained to perceive that as a very high level of failure. And so this was my last experiment, and so it was very scary, and I started to get very, honestly, panicked. And that was the main emotion that started to take over because, no, there's a time crunch. It's not something that I can just do on my own time. These are live animal experiments. And so the main emotions that really started to come up for me was that I felt very stupid, honestly, and almost as if I had a lot of hubris in kind of planning this new experiment, this new idea, and I started thinking, maybe I don't know what I'm doing because as I said, I thought every bit of care and carefulness into this experiment. I had all the spreadsheets, schedules, undergraduate assistants, everything was planned to a great extent. And it was just failing. Like that was just how it was. The animals were not learning. The experiment was going to be, largely unusable or incomplete. So this personally affected me a lot. I personally would never recommend the work-life balance I had in grad school. I had a really horrible work-life balance already, and that's something that I'm improving now to a really great degree now that I'm in this position. But I was already, at that point, somebody who would, if given the opportunity, sacrifice their own time, all of their own time, to keep working. I really saw that as my life and what I needed to be doing. And so when this happened and when I started to get panicked, I started to dive into that even more and think like, oh, I need to spend every hour I have trying to fix this. Whatever I can do to save this. I had a very black and white, very hero-like mentality. I thought I needed to do whatever I need to do to fix this. And so it affected me in that sense during that period. I was not sleeping well. I was crying a lot. It was very unusual. I had this emotional release from this failure that I hadn't felt before. And I actually felt bad a lot because I was calling my mom a lot and crying. I felt like I was putting a lot of emotional burden on my family and people around me. And so personally, it affected me in that way. And I was very down on myself, very doom and gloom. From a professional perspective, I think it really affected my perception of my own expertise at this point, because this was at the end of graduate school, and this is when people start telling you, oh, well, like you're an expert in your field, you're an expert in your field. And because I had failed to such a great degree, I thought that this really affected my perception of my own expertise. I felt ready to go at that point because I had a postdoc job lined up at an institution I was excited to go to, and I started to feel like, oh, that's not, like, I'm not at that level. I'm not going to be able to do that. I was very proud of this job I had lined up at UCLA, and I was excited. And I was excited for this experiment as well. It's something I've been planning for years, and it wasn't going well. I did feel like, oh my God, professionally, I'm not at the level of expertise that I was, and maybe I need more training. So it affected my professional self-esteem. I coped with this at that time, first of all, by being pretty isolated. I would say I was pretty isolated, not in a complete sense. I had people around me who cared for me, who knew about me, but I felt like very intellectually isolated. I started keeping a lot of my thoughts to myself. I stopped talking to people about my research for a while, even people who I would previously discuss, every detail of my work with. And I was almost a little bit scared at that point. And so I definitely isolated myself a little bit. And I started, particularly in Arizona, where I went to grad school, going on long hikes, which sounds good, but I would almost sometimes do so in like an unsafe way. I would go on like long hikes. I would go alone. I wouldn't tell anyone. And it was a very isolated way of trying to cope, in my opinion. And also, part of me was trying to tire myself out, I think, physically by going on these long hikes so that I could sleep, because I felt my sleep was also disrupted. So that was one of the ways that I definitely coped. One thing that I do differently now, though, is first of all, I try to seek out people and community. I try to go against my instincts to isolate, because I do have that instinct. And I try to remind myself that I don't dislike people. Sometimes when I get down on myself, I like to think that other people might think of me that way as well. So I think that's why I isolate myself. But I try to, when I feel this way now, seek community and remind myself that I don't hate people. I don't dislike being around people, which is difficult, especially when you feel like you're going through a period of failure or going through a fear of feeling down on myself. And now I try to resist that instinct as much as possible. And another way I coped at the time was eating really unhealthy. And I don't necessarily think that it's bad to eat unhealthy. I don't eat super healthy, but I think people should eat and enjoy. But I feel that at that time I was ignoring kind of hunger cues and things like that. I was letting my stress dictate a lot of my rhythms in a way that was not healthy. And so I try to notice that. And so recognizing that how my body feels and my feelings aren't always necessarily correlated. And so those are kind of some ways that I've adjusted. I'm definitely still working on it. I think this is a lifelong process to learn how to cope with stress and also realize that stress and failure will always arise. And it's hard not to take things personally or think that you're the only person who's ever failed so miserably. But I find that talking to other people about it is also helpful. And so if you have that instinct, I try to resist that instinct. Yeah. So I think that was a really important event in my life. This whole period of failure in my life was really important to me. And I think that going through that experience is what allowed me to realize that I was actually burnt out. I had been told by people, just because of this very black and white way that I worked, by people around me, that you're gonna burn out, you're gonna burn out. And I had always heard this term of burnout and kind of perceived it as, oh, you just like run out of energy and then get tired, and then you'll sleep and then you'll be less tired, and that's okay. But I had a level of immaturity in that, I think, in that thinking, and then this experience really made me realize what burnout actually is. It's like, oh no, this is a I can't do this anymore kind of burnout. There's like a physical and emotional event that occurs that is actually burnout, and it's not just being tired. And I went through this like extreme emotional experience of total failure and really doing a lot of inventory of how I feel about this and why do I feel this way about this. And I really needed to start to think about these things when going into my new position at the time as a postdoc. Like, how am I going to take care of myself so that I don't necessarily take everything as a extreme personal failure? So that affected me, and I think that it allowed me to, when I did reach my postdoc, give myself permission to have the separation a little bit of like, okay, there's my own personal failures, yes, and I should care about my work, but also allowing myself, giving myself permission to have space from the results of my science and from my own failures a little bit. And it still bothers me when things go wrong a lot. I think obviously it's good to care. I think it's good when things bother you, it's good to care. But moving forward, I think I was able to start thinking about how do I, why it's okay for me to think of myself separately from my science. And I also think that it was a positive experience in one sense, which is that my mentor in graduate school, who had always been a good mentor, he expected a lot from me. This was an opportunity for him to kind of help me learn that this was part of the deal, that this kind of extreme level of failure, at least I perceived it to be a very extreme level of failure, is that it's actually kind of somewhat routine and it happens, right? So that's something that I definitely, he could see my work and what I was doing and realize that it was a lesson for me that these sorts of things can happen and they do pass. So a lot of this comes from perspective and it's not easy to gain. So I don't want to give the perspective that in the moment you feel this way. So a lot of this comes from time. But one thing that helps me is to keep thinking about how the whole experience of graduate school and being a graduate student and especially getting a PhD or a master's or whatever is not just to be educated and complete the assigned tasks that you're assigned, but it's truly to gain expertise. And expertise is exactly that, right? You're an expert. And part of being an expert is knowing how to handle things when things don't go well. And not just don't go well at a very low level. At a very high level, they really don't go well or to a very extreme degree. And so I don't think you can gain expertise if everything is always going well. And so I spend a lot of time teaching students to do really hard stuff like surgeries, microscopy, things that are empirically hard, and they do well at these things. And the reason that the students, though, are not yet experts is because if something goes wrong, they have to come to their mentor, right? They have to come to me or a graduate student or whoever's supervising them. And so just know that having the perspective of failing and thinking about what went wrong and having the experience of something that you worked really hard on going very wrong is a huge part of the experience that you're going to have and the expertise that you're going to have to be able to mentor other people. And so I think that's a really big thing. It's not easy to remember in the moment, but I do think it's true in retrospect. And so that's my biggest advice is kind of understanding that you're gaining expertise and always keep that in perspective. And another piece of advice that I have is that a lot of times in graduate school, because we are mentored by small groups of people, or even sometimes in the case of a PhD, one person, I think a lot of grad students get into a mode of comparing themselves to their mentors. And it's important to remember that you're not your mentor. I don't think that people compare themselves to their mentor on purpose, but oftentimes we're doing similar work to our mentor, similar science. And so we might be trying to replicate the success of the people who mentor us and even the scientific results of the people who mentor us. But remembering your own experience and the experience of failure is actually what's going to give you the experience that will separate you from your mentor, right? You're building your own scientific story, your own experiences, and that's something big too. So when you fail, a lot of graduate students try to say, oh, well, my mentor didn't fail in this way, or when they did this, it worked. And, they're a professor now, so they probably never went through anything like this. But no, this is actually all the noise, to use a statistical term, like a noise in your story. And of things not going in a straightforward way. And that's actually how you're gaining problem solving skills and gaining your experience. And so that's data, right? That's data that you collect and that you know, and it's important to add noise to the data so that you can have a broader experience. And so I think the main thing that I think about is that I had a lot of naivete. I think more than even most people who go into graduate school about what a lab is and literally what the role of a graduate student is. I think it's hard to understand that role. I didn't even know. And so I think that almost made me feel like a little bit of failure because I was like, oh, I should know. But again, in the end, all of this is because I'm trying to become my own expert and become my own scientist. So it's okay that I had a different experience, and it's okay that I had to learn things a different way. Thanks for watching Failsafe Science. My name is Tanya Gupta, and I hope my story helps graduate students feel less alone.